Clarence House, London. The morning of 31 March, 2002. William Tallon has been running the Queen Mother's household for 51 years. He entered royal service at 15, writing letters to Buckingham Palace until someone said yes. On this particular morning, the phone rings. A journalist is calling. The journalist wants a statement. He tells Talon that Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died at Royal Lodge, Windsor, at 3:15 the previous afternoon. Nobody from the palace had called him. Talon had danced with her almost every day from the mid-1950s until she was too frail to stand, sometimes in her sitting room at Clarence House after the lunch guests departed, sometimes at Balmoral balls when he was required to join the Scottish reels. He made her gin and tonics the way she liked them, 9/10 gin, 1/10 tonic. He'd been her closest below-stairs confidant for 5 decades. The information that she was gone reached him through a reporter who needed a quote. Tom Quinn's 2015 biography, Backstairs Billy, is the most comprehensive account of life in the Queen Mother's household from the servant's perspective. His 2025 follow-up, Yes Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants, extends the record. Major Colin Burgess, who served as her equerry from 1994 to 1996 on secondment from the Irish Guards, published his own memoir, Behind Palace Doors, in 2007, a first-person document from someone who spent 2 years constantly at her side. Between those sources and the Channel 4 documentary Backstairs Billy, broadcast in 2009, a substantial body of named, incident-level testimony exists in print and on camera. The general verdict, that she was cold to those who served her, that resentment accumulated below stairs while the public saw only warmth, is already established and widely documented. What these biographies add is evidence that the general verdict flattens: who said what to whom, in which room, in which year, and what the consequences were. Almost nobody resigned from the Queen Mother's personal service during her lifetime. This is the most instructive fact in the entire record, and it isn't evidence that conditions were acceptable. It's evidence of a system in which leaving carried severe enough penalties that most people chose silence instead, and in which the household's punitive mechanisms were directed primarily at those who stepped outside its invisible rules, rather than those who suffered under its visible ones. Quinn describes the structural arithmetic clearly in Yes Ma'am. Average pay below stairs in the royal household was sometimes on a par with that of a road sweeper, alongside what he describes as extraordinarily long hours. Contemporary reporting from 2002, when the Queen Mother's household dissolved after her death, placed most Clarence House salaries between £18,000 and £25,000 per year. Junior positions, porters, housemaids, coachmen, had recently been raised from £9,000 to £14,500. The royal family carried, in Quinn's characterization and in contemporaneous press reporting, a reputation as mean payers. Most below-stairs staff also lived in tied accommodation, housing that came bundled with the employment. Gate Lodge, the cottage attached to Clarence House that Talon occupied for decades, is the most prominent example in the record. Royal Lodge at Windsor had its own tied arrangements. The Castle of May, the property the Queen Mother purchased in Caithness in 1952, used the Granary Lodge on the grounds as staff accommodation. This structural reality meant that resignation was never a single decision. It was 2 simultaneous ones, losing the income and the housing at the same moment, in a country with a thin market for former royal servants who had spent decades in one closed institution and had little else on their employment history. Quinn estimated the Queen Mother employed approximately 60 personal attendants at any one time, which he describes as almost medieval extravagance. Clarence House alone ran a staff of roughly 50 below stairs, divided from the upper house, the private secretaries, treasurers, ladies-in-waiting, and equerries who managed the public calendar, by a hierarchy that operated as effectively as a physical wall. A footman setting a dining table didn't share corridors with the private secretary coordinating a state visit. The people cooking, cleaning, and carrying had no formal channel to the people managing access to the Queen Mother's time. Movement between categories wasn't a feature of the system. The system was designed to be invisible, and largely it was. A fragment of text from Quinn's Backstairs Billy, in what is accessible from the book's preview material, references the difficulty of finding staff because the turnover was so high. That phrase is a structural description, not an anecdote about one difficult year. It suggests a household from which people regularly chose to leave, despite the financial penalties of doing so. The specific reasons those departures happened are, by and large, not in the written record, precisely because the exit cost was high enough that people who survived the household tended not to speak publicly afterward. Marion Crawford isn't a below-stairs figure in the strict sense. She held the position of governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret for approximately 16 years beginning in the 1930s, an intimate role, daily proximity to the royal family's private world, fundamentally distinct from housemaid or footman. The distinction matters for accuracy. What her case documents is the consequence architecture of the Queen Mother's household, what happened when someone who had been trusted with proximity broke the one rule that apparently had no exceptions. Crawford retired when Princess Margaret turned 20. The retirement came with a formal gift of the use of Nottingham Cottage at Kensington Palace. She then sought permission to publish a memoir of her years with the princesses. The Queen Mother refused. Crawford published anyway. The Little Princesses appeared in 1950, describing the games the princesses played as children, their ponies, their daily routines, their lessons. Nothing especially revelatory, nothing damaging. By any reasonable measure, a gentle book. The royal family cut off all contact, immediately, permanently, the Queen Mother included. Crawford moved to Aberdeen, where she bought a house on the specific route the royals used when traveling north to Balmoral. She was there every summer, watching the cavalcade pass. Nobody stopped. Nobody wrote. Nobody sent a message through any intermediary. The silence held from 1950 until February 11, 1988, when Crawford died. Even that didn't break it. Quinn notes, in describing the Queen Mother's management style across his research, that she conveyed disapproval through silence and an icy expression rather than raised voice, which some staff found psychologically difficult. Crawford's experience compressed that silence into 38 years. She hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't revealed a scandal. She had decided that her own memories, accumulated across 16 years of intimate service, belonged to her. The response was calibrated to demonstrate that the Queen Mother's definition of loyalty had no natural expiration and no capacity for exceptions. Crawford's case established the punishment model for the household. The people documented in the below-stairs testimony from Clarence House never crossed her in that way. They were too structurally vulnerable to risk it. But the model was known, and the knowledge shaped behavior. The question of what happened to people who merely worked under difficult internal conditions, rather than breaking an explicit rule, is answered across the rest of the documented record. The incident that appears most directly in the Channel 4 documentary from a named former staff member concerns the dining table at Clarence House. Liam Cullen Brooks provides the account. Junior members of the below-stairs staff would lay the table carefully, cruets positioned precisely, cutlery aligned, settings arranged to the household standards. William Tallon, as steward and page of the backstairs from 1978, holding head of household status below stairs with direct access to the Queen Mother's private apartments, would move through and place dirty cruets among the clean ones. The younger aides would notice, or a supervisor would notice. The complaint would reach the Queen Mother. She used to just smile. Cullen Brooks is on record, identified by name, describing this exactly. Not that she was unaware of it, but that she was informed directly and responded with amusement. Talon was simultaneously the most trusted below-stairs figure in the household and the subject of the complaint. Her smile was her verdict, and the verdict was communicated clearly. He is protected. You already knew that, and bringing the complaint here was itself a small error of judgment. The broader picture Quinn's research builds of Talon's conduct below stairs is more extensive than the Cruets incident alone. The Royal Central Review of Quinn's biography, drawing on the book's material, records that junior male staff at Clarence House navigated behavior Quinn describes as predatory. Talon using his position to pursue sexual contact with staff who had no effective recourse because the person they would report to was the one they were reporting about. The atmosphere Quinn describes through multiple accounts is one of a below-stairs environment in which Talon's favor was the only meaningful protection available, and his disfavor was genuinely dangerous. The Dirty Cruet incident is the most vivid documented case of that dynamic in public record because Cullen Brooks named it on camera. But it sits within a portrait of a household environment in which the person responsible for it was structurally insulated from accountability by the employer's choice. Eric Gray was another former Clarence House servant who gave Quinn material for Backstairs Billy. Gray's account describes the daily working atmosphere of the household from the inside. Talon regularly whispering running commentary to the Queen Mother about the staff and household figures moving through the rooms, timed to land before the subject arrived. Gray's example is specific. Spotting a senior equerry crossing the room toward them, Talon would mutter, "Ooh, lottie-bloody-da, here she comes." And by the time the equerry reached the pair, both Talon and the Queen Mother were quietly laughing at something the equerry couldn't identify. The target was the last person in the room to understand what had just happened. Quinn's reporting indicates this was a consistent practice rather than an occasional one. Former staff described the below-stairs atmosphere consistently as bitchy in Quinn's accounts. Gray's testimony gives that word a specific shape, a page with direct access to the employer's ear, using that access as a continuous private performance at other people's expense, with the employer's active participation. Those who were the subjects of these whispered observations had no mechanism for responding to it. Talon controlled the access. The Queen Mother found the commentary entertaining. A tabloid report surfaced in 1991 that a young man had been brought back to Clarence House by Talon. Among the courtiers and upper house officials who had long resented Talon's privileges and the latitude the Queen Mother extended to him below stairs, the hope was clear. This was finally actionable. Several of them brought the matter to her attention directly. Hugo Vickers, the authorized biographer, confirmed the Queen Mother's response in the Channel 4 documentary On Camera. She asked, "How kind of William to invite that poor boy in out of the rain." No reprimand, no formal acknowledgement, not even a change in expression. The courtiers received nothing. The junior staff who shared the building with Talon's conduct received no institutional signal that any limits existed. Quinn documents this pattern across his reporting as a structural feature of life at Clarence House, rather than a series of isolated decisions. The working certainty, understood by everyone in the household, that whatever Talon did, the employer whose residence it was, would absorb the complaint without visible reaction. The Queen Mother had reportedly told Talon at some early point in their relationship, in a line Quinn preserves in Backstairs Billy, "Whatever you do, William, never trust anyone. Ever." That is the kind of instruction that tells you something about the person giving it. Quinn's research also documents photographs found in Talon's private album after his death. One showed his partner Reginald Wilcock wearing one of the Queen Mother's tiaras while visibly drunk. A second showed both Talon and Wilcock dancing in the Queen Mother's hats, her own property. She discovered the photographs. Her response, according to Quinn's reporting, "I don't mind you wearing them, but you must put them back where you found them." Wilcock had entered the Queen Mother's service as a footman at Clarence House in 1960, following 2 years as valet to the Duke of Windsor in Paris. He and Talon had been partners for more than 3 decades. When the Queen Mother learned that her partner had been photographed wearing her tiara, her concern was about where the tiara was placed afterward. Major Colin Burgess spent 2 years constantly at the Queen Mother's side as her equerry, from 1994 until 1996, on secondment from the Irish Guards. His memoir, Behind Palace Doors, published in 2007, 5 years after her death, is the closest document in print to a first-person account of what her working day actually looked like from inside the inner circle. Burgess documents her daily drinking schedule with specific precision. Dubonnet and gin at noon, red wine at lunch, port afterward, a martini at what the household referred to as magic hour, pink champagne at dinner. Her particular fondness, Burgess notes, was for heavy clarets. The social atmosphere at her events was deliberately constructed. The social wheels were also lubricated by large amounts of alcohol, he writes. He describes her fondness for red wine in particular as memorable. The working expectation extended to everyone around her. When a guest at her table requested water instead of wine, the response Burgess documents was a direct question addressed to the table. How can you not have wine with your meal? Quinn's reporting in Yes, Ma'am describes Talon enforcing the same expectation at her lunch parties through more physical means, making sure every guest had an alcoholic drink in hand, and reportedly pouring wine through a guest's fingers if they attempted to cover their glass. This is an expectation that operated as hospitality. The language was that of a generous host. The mechanism was closer to a requirement. The people professionally obligated to attend her events, staff, seconded officials, people without the social standing to decline or leave early, occupied a different position relative to that expectation than the aristocratic guests who chose to be there. This account circulates widely in popular coverage under Lady Colin Campbell's name. It isn't Campbell's. The source is Burgess, who was there, and whose memoir is a direct first-person document of the specific period. Campbell's 2012 biography of the Queen Mother focuses primarily on claims about the Queen Mother's birth parentage and biological origins that other royal biographers, including Hugo Vickers, have publicly challenged. Campbell's core informants, by her own account, are members of the aristocracy and royal circle, not below-stairs household staff. Her book does not function as a parallel corroborating source for the working conditions of Clarence House servants in the way Quinn and Burgess do. When attribution matters, Burgess's account is the one that bears the weight on the drinking demands. Burgess's own departure was scheduled and routine, the end of a military secondment. He didn't resign over conditions. Quinn's Yes, Ma'am contains one account that sits entirely differently from the rest. A gillie, an outdoor servant for fishing and hiking excursions, who worked with the Queen Mother on the River Dee near Balmoral, describes himself as quite junior and notes that she was entirely unbothered by his rank. During a fishing trip, she failed a cast. He had formed the habit of offering polite, practical correction when she failed to cast in the right place or retrieved her line too quickly or too slowly. On one occasion, after a particularly bad attempt, she fell into his arms. She told him, "You remind me of my husband." He considered it a great compliment. She also established a private code word for the worse casts. "I made a complete pig's ear of that, didn't I?" she said. "Next time I make a bugger's muddle of a cast, just shout 'Christmas,' and I will know." This is the only account in these sources of the Queen Mother being physically caught by a junior outdoor servant, responding with warmth instead of embarrassment, and establishing a shared private language with someone at the bottom of the household hierarchy. Quinn includes it in a book otherwise populated with accounts of institutional dysfunction, and the contrast is the point. Outdoors, informal, without the Clarence House machinery around her, she could be exactly the person the public thought she was. The gillie on the riverbank received that version. Liam Cullen Brooks at the dining table received the smile over the dirty cruets. The gulf between those two experiences is structural, not random. At Clarence House, the layers of the household meant that the Queen Mother's direct interactions with below-stairs staff were heavily mediated, filtered through Talon, managed through the upper house officials, shaped by the architecture of a residence whose hidden corridors and servants' passages were designed specifically to keep household machinery invisible. The outdoor context near Balmoral had none of that. Just her, a river, and a gilly who reminded her of her husband. The warmth she showed him was real. It was also a function of circumstance that below-stairs staff in London's domestic machinery had no access to. Some months after 30 March 2002, Talon received a short letter. It informed him that Gate Lodge, the cottage he had occupied for years, the Queen Mother's extension of tied accommodation to her most trusted below-stairs servant, needed to be vacated. No leaving party, no letter of thanks, no formal farewell ceremony for 51 years of service. Talon wrote to his friend Rita Michael. In the Channel 4 documentary, she reads from his letter, "My dear Rita, life is bloody at the moment, and I must move house within the month. The palace and privy purse have behaved appallingly, but what can one do?" Quinn's biography quotes him directly on the larger situation. "I was upset, and they didn't care. As far as the household was concerned, I was simply an ex-employee, as if I'd worked in the palace for 6 months washing bottles. It hurt, but the truth is, some members of the royal household enjoyed my unhappiness. It was time for their revenge. They knew the Queen Mother could no longer protect me, so the knives were out." He moved to a ground-floor flat in Kennington, South London, arranged through the Duchy of Cornwall. Prince Charles reportedly supplemented his pension by approximately £100 per week. The tabloid press pursued him for months, staking out the street, following him from gatherings, pressing for accounts of the Queen Mother's private life. He said nothing. He declined every formal interview request. He never published the memoir he had reportedly been drafting in the years after her death. The only verified public statement he made about her was 30 seconds of footage on the way to her funeral. She was the most wonderful employer, very compassionate, incredibly kind, very understanding, and I loved her. He was found dead in his Kennington flat on 23 November 2007, aged 72. His funeral was held at the Queen's Chapel in St. James's Palace. More than 200 people attended. Derek Jacobi and Patricia Routledge gave readings, and the congregation included Roy Strong, June Brown, and Paul O'Grady. His collection of royal memorabilia, personal letters, gifts, photographs, programs from decades at Clarence House, was auctioned. He had apparently told people he intended to leave the collection to the royal collection. He had never formalized that intention. After the auction, Quinn records, a small group of men had already entered the Kennington flat, boxed up Talon's possessions, and removed them. Not a scrap of written material survived. Whatever he had drafted about 51 years of mornings at Clarence House, whatever private observations he had accumulated about the household's operations, its inner workings, and the specific incidents he had watched and participated in across 5 decades. It's gone. The tabloids who had pursued him for years received nothing. The memoir that might have existed doesn't. Around Talon, in the weeks after 30 March 2002, approximately 30 below-stairs Clarence House staff had received redundancy notices. Of more than 40 household employees, only roughly 12 found continued royal employment, absorbed primarily into the Prince of Wales's establishment. Chef Michael Seal and page Leslie Chappell were among those retained. Ladies-in-waiting faced immediate contract termination. A palace spokesperson told The Guardian at the time that when any member of the royal family dies, their staff, in effect, become redundant. Not all of those 30 received pensions. The redundancy letters were the entirety of the institutional response to careers that had, in several cases, lasted decades. These were the people who set the tables and received the smile over the dirty cruets, the people who were told to cover glass with their hands and had wine poured through their fingers, the people who filed formal complaints with nowhere for those complaints to go. They lost their income and their housing in the same administrative action, handled by the same palace and privy purse that Talon described as having behaved appallingly in his letter to Rita Michael. The record the biographies actually contain isn't a sequence of dramatic resignations. It's a portrait of a household organized almost entirely around one woman's comfort and one woman's preferences, in which the closest inner circle could do almost anything because she would neutralize the consequences for them. And the people below that circle had no formal recourse that functioned in practice. Cullen Brooks brought a complaint about the cruets, and she smiled. The courtiers brought a tabloid scandal in 1991, and she dissolved it with a single deflective sentence. Crawford published a gentle memoir and lost 38 years. Marion Crawford wrote down memories of children playing in a garden. The response was decades of silence in Aberdeen. Liam Cullen Brooks reported dirty cruets to the employer. The response was amusement. 30 people received letters about their housing the month their employer died. The response was that this was the standard arrangement. The Queen Mother reportedly told the diarist Woodrow Wyatt at some point, "I'm not as nice as you think." That admission is the most honest line any source in these books attributes to her directly. It's also, given everything the record documents about how the household actually operated, a considerable understatement. Reputation is what people say about someone. Record is what can be named, dated, and sourced. The Queen Mother's reputation for being difficult with staff was established, repeated, and is by now widely known. The record is more specific and harder to dismiss. It exists in Quinn's 2 books, in Burgess's memoir, in Cullen Brooks's camera testimony, in Eric Gray's named account of the whispered running commentary, in the documented text of Talon's letter to Rita Michael, and in the palace spokesperson's statement to The Guardian about what it means, institutionally, for a royal household to dissolve. That record isn't about a single cruel employer on a single bad day. It's about a system of protection and indifference that ran consistently for 5 decades across every property and every category of staff the household contained, right up until the morning a journalist called Clarence House to ask for a statement.